black metropolis within the larger city. And from this foundation, something extraordinary would emerge. The Great Migration didn't just change the lives of the people who migrated. It fundamentally transformed American society, economy, politics, and culture. The America that existed before the Great Migration was a very different country from the America that existed after. Let's break down how. Let's start with the most measurable impact, economics. 6 million people moving from one region to another represented a massive shift of labor and economic potential. For the North, this influx of workers fueled industrial growth during critical periods. During World War I, black migrants kept factories running when European immigration stopped. During World War II, they filled jobs left empty by soldiers fighting overseas and powered the arsenal of democracy that built tanks, planes, and ships. Industries that had relied on European immigrant labor were transformed by black workers. The meatpacking industry in Chicago, the steel industry in Pittsburgh, the auto industry in Detroit, all were revolutionized by black labor. By 1930, black workers made up significant percentages of the workforce in these industries. But the economic impact went beyond just providing labor. Black migrants created new markets. They spent wages on housing, food, clothing, and entertainment. This created demand that fueled business growth. And crucially, because they often faced discrimination in white-owned businesses, they created their own businesses. The emergence of black business districts in cities like Harlem in New York, Bronzeville in Chicago, and Paradise Valley in Detroit represented real wealth creation. These weren't just mom-and-pop shops. These were thriving commercial centers with banks, insurance companies, hotels, theaters, and professional services. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, before it was destroyed in the 1921 massacre, showed what was possible. For the South, the economic impact was more ambiguous. In the short term, the loss of labor created crisis. Landowners who had relied on cheap black labor suddenly faced shortages. Some raised wages to keep workers from leaving. Others increased mechanization, especially in cotton production. The cotton picking machine, which became widespread in the 1940s and 1950s, was partly a response to labor shortages created by the Great Migration. In the long term, the South's economy had to modernize. The sharecropping system that had dominated for decades became less viable. This eventually led to a more diverse, industrialized Southern economy, though that transformation took decades and came with its own costs. Perhaps the most profound impact of the Great Migration was political. When black Americans moved north, they moved into states where they could vote. Let that sink in. In Mississippi in 1920, only about 1% of black adults were registered to vote, thanks to poll taxes, literacy tests, and violent intimidation. In Chicago, they could register and vote freely. This shift in political power was seismic. By the 1930s and 1940s, black voters in northern cities became a crucial voting bloc that politicians couldn't ignore. In the 1936 presidential election, black voters played a key role in Franklin Roosevelt's landslide victory. They helped elect black representatives to Congress from northern districts, something that hadn't happened since Reconstruction. The concentration of black voters in urban areas of swing states gave them disproportionate political influence. Politicians who wanted to win states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan had to pay attention to black concerns. This created pressure for civil rights legislation and anti-discrimination policies at the federal level. It also enabled the rise of black political machines and black political leaders. People like William Dawson in Chicago, Adam Clayton Powell in New York, and later figures like Charles Diggs in Detroit became power brokers. They could deliver votes, which gave them leverage. The Great Migration also contributed to the eventual realignment of American politics. For decades after the Civil War, black voters who could vote supported the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. But during the Great Depression, many black voters switched to the Democratic Party, attracted by New Deal programs and Roosevelt's rhetoric about economic justice. This shift intensified during the Civil Rights era and fundamentally changed the political map of America. But political power came with backlash. As black populations grew in northern cities, white residents and politicians resisted. This brings us to one of the darkest aspects of the Great Migration's impact. When black migrants arrived in northern cities, they needed places to live. But they quickly discovered that northern freedom had limits. Housing discrimination was pervasive and systematic. Landlords refused to rent to black tenants. Real estate agents wouldn't show houses in white neighborhoods to black buyers. Banks denied mortgages or offered them on predatory terms. And in many cities, homeowners formed neighborhood improvement associations with the explicit goal of keeping black families out. They used restrictive covenants, legal clauses in property deeds that prohibited selling to non-white buyers, to maintain segregation. When these informal methods weren't enough, white residents used violence. When a black family moved into a white neighborhood, their homes were sometimes firebombed. Mobs gathered to intimidate and threaten. Riots erupted in cities across the North, Detroit in 1943, Chicago in 1919, and others, often sparked by housing tensions. The result was residential segregation that was, in many cases, more complete than it had been in the South. Black migrants were forced into overcrowded neighborhoods that white residents were abandoning. These neighborhoods became the urban ghettos we're familiar with today. The South Side of Chicago, Harlem in New York, the Hill District in Pittsburgh, Paradise Valley in Detroit. Landlords knew black tenants had few options, so they charged high rents for substandard housing. Overcrowding was severe. Families doubled up in apartments. Boarding houses were packed. Buildings weren't maintained. In winter, heat was inadequate. Plumbing failed. The federal government made this worse. New Deal housing programs, which provided mortgages and built public housing, were explicitly segregated. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual literally recommended against insuring mortgages in integrated neighborhoods or in neighborhoods with black residents. This practice, called redlining, denied wealth-building opportunities to generations of black families. After World War II, when the federal government subsidized suburban development through programs like the GI Bill, black veterans were systematically excluded. The suburbs that grew up around American cities in the 1950s and 1960s were white by design. Black families remained concentrated in urban cores as white families moved out, taking their tax dollars with them. This created a cycle of disadvantage. Black neighborhoods had less tax revenue, which meant worse schools, worse public services, worse infrastructure. This fueled poverty, which fueled crime, which was used to justify further discrimination. The effects of these policies are still visible today in the racial wealth gap, in educational disparities, in health outcomes. But let me be clear, the Great Migration didn't create these problems. Racism and discrimination created them. The Great Migration just made them visible in northern cities where they had previously been less apparent. Now let's talk about culture, because this is where the Great Migration's impact becomes undeniable and frankly exciting. When migrants came north, they brought their culture with them, their music, their food, their religious traditions, their ways of speaking and storytelling. And in the urban north, these traditions collided with and mixed with other cultures, European immigrant cultures, Caribbean cultures, northern black cultures that had existed before the migration. The result was an explosion of creativity that changed American culture forever. Let's start with music. In the South, Black Americans had developed musical traditions rooted in African heritage, shaped by slavery, work songs, field hollers, spirituals, and blues. When this music came north, it evolved and diversified. Blues became urbanized. The Mississippi Delta blues of Robert Johnson became the Chicago blues of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, electric, amplified, intense. This music spoke to the migrant experience, the loneliness of the city, the hard work, the longing for home, but also the newfound freedom and possibility. Jazz, which had originated in New Orleans, exploded in northern cities, Chicago, New York, Kansas City. These became jazz capitals. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, many of the most iconic jazz musicians were either migrants or children of migrants. Jazz clubs in Harlem and the South Side became sites of innovation, where musicians pushed boundaries and created new sounds. Gospel music was transformed in northern churches. Migrants brought southern gospel traditions. But in the large urban churches of the North, gospel became more elaborate, more performance-oriented. Artists like Mahalia Jackson and Thomas Dorsey pioneered a new gospel sound that influenced everything that came after. And then, crucially, these musical traditions gave birth to new genres. Rhythm and blues evolved from blues and gospel in the 1940s and 1950s. Rock and roll emerged from the mixing of R&B with country and other influences, and many of the pioneers, like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, were products of the Great Migration experience. Soul music in the 1960s and 1970s reflected the urban black experience shaped by migration. And later, hip-hop emerged from the streets of New York, influenced by the children and grandchildren of migrants. If you listen to popular music today, any genre, you're hearing echoes of the Great Migration. The musical culture of America was fundamentally created and shaped by this movement of people. The Great Migration fueled artistic creativity beyond music. The concentration of Black Americans in urban centers created audiences for Black art and literature. It created communities where Black artists could support each other and push boundaries. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s was the most famous example. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, and Countee Cullen produced literature that explored Black identity, celebrated Black culture, and critiqued American racism. This wasn't just writing for white audiences. This was Black people writing for themselves, defining themselves on their own terms. This continued in subsequent decades. Richard Wright's Native Son and Black Boy drew directly from the migrant experience. James Baldwin, who grew up in Harlem as the son and stepson of migrants, became one of the 20th century's most important writers. Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun told the story of a Black family on Chicago's South Side navigating housing discrimination. Visual artists like Jacob Lawrence documented the migration itself. His Migration series, 60 panels depicting the movement of Black Americans from South to North, is one of the most important works of 20th century American art. Even sports were transformed. The Great Migration coincided with and contributed to the integration of professional sports. Jackie Robinson, who broke baseball's color barrier in 1947, was born in Georgia, but grew up in California after his family migrated. Many of the black athletes who integrated professional baseball, football, and basketball in the 1940s and 1950s were migrants or children of migrants. Sports became a space where black Americans could demonstrate excellence and demand respect. And because sports were so visible and so important to American culture, black athletic achievement helped shift public opinion on race. So we've talked about what happened, who it happened to, and what the immediate impacts were. Now I want to talk about why this matters today. Why should you care about something that happened between 1916 and 1970? Because the Great Migration's effects are all around you, whether you realize it or not. Look at a map of where black Americans live today. The distribution is radically different from what it was in 1900. In 1900, about 90% of black Americans lived in the South, mostly in rural areas. Today, the black population is more evenly distributed across regions, with major concentrations in urban areas throughout the country. The cities we think of as having significant black populations, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, became that way because of the Great Migration. The neighborhoods within those cities that are historically black exist because of the Great Migration and the segregation that followed it. And this demographic shift has political implications that persist. The concentration of black voters in urban areas of swing states continues to be politically significant. Elections are won and lost based on turnout in cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee, cities shaped by the Great Migration. Remember how I talked about the creation of urban ghettos? That didn't go away. In fact, in some ways, it got worse. The segregation created during the Great Migration era was reinforced by decades of discriminatory policies and practices. Even after the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made housing discrimination illegal, segregation persisted through more subtle mechanisms. White flight continued. Predatory lending targeted black neighborhoods. Discriminatory policing and mass incarceration destabilized black communities. Gentrification has recently displaced longtime black residents from neighborhoods their families had lived in for generations. Many of the most segregated cities in America today, Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, are cities that received large numbers of black migrants and then systematically segregated them. The racial wealth gap, educational achievement gaps, health disparities, all of these have roots in the housing discrimination and economic exclusion that migrants and their descendants faced. But the legacy isn't all negative. Let's talk about culture again, because this is crucial. American culture, the culture that dominates globally, is disproportionately influenced by black American culture. And black American culture was profoundly shaped by the Great Migration. Think about it. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, soul, funk, disco, hip-hop, R&B. These genres, which originated in or were shaped by black communities, are the foundation of modern popular music worldwide. When someone in Tokyo or London or Sao Paulo listens to music, they're often listening to musical forms created by black Americans, many of whom were products of the Great Migration experience. Fashion, language, dance, food. Black cultural innovations have been adopted and adapted by mainstream American culture and then exported globally. The foods we think of as soul food, fried chicken, collard greens, sweet potato pie, came north with the migrants and became iconic American dishes. This cultural influence is enormous and often under-acknowledged. The Great Migration didn't just move people, it moved culture, and that culture became American culture. The Great Migration also offers lessons about migration itself, lessons that are relevant today when migration is one of the most contentious political issues in the world. First, people migrate when staying becomes impossible. The Great Migration wasn't a whim. It was a response to oppression, economic desperation, and violence. Today, when we see migration from Central America, from Syria, from Sub-Saharan Africa, we should remember that people don't leave their homes lightly. They leave when staying means suffering or death. Second, migrants face hostility in their new homes, even when those new homes need their labor. Black migrants were recruited to northern cities, but once they arrived, they faced discrimination and violence. This pattern repeats throughout history. Migrants are wanted for their labor, but resented for their presence. Third, migrants enrich their new communities culturally and economically, even when those communities don't initially welcome them. The cultural flowering that emerged from the Great Migration benefited all of America, not just Black Americans. The economic contributions of migrants helped build the industrial base that made America a superpower. Fourth, the effects of migration last for generations. We're still living with the consequences of the Great Migration, both positive and negative. Policy decisions made in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s about housing, education, and employment still shape American life today. Here's something interesting. The Great Migration isn't the end of the story. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating in the 1990s and 2000s, Black Americans began moving back to the South. Demographers call this the reverse migration, or New Great Migration. Why? Several reasons. The South changed. Jim Crow ended. The South's economy grew and diversified, creating opportunities. Meanwhile, northern cities experienced deindustrialization, with the loss of manufacturing jobs that had drawn migrants in the first place. Cities like Detroit and Cleveland, which had boomed during the migration, fell into decline. Many Black Americans, especially middle-class professionals, found better opportunities in growing southern cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston, and Dallas. Others sought to reconnect with family roots, to retire in the region their grandparents had fled. This reverse migration is itself a fascinating chapter in American history, showing how migration patterns respond to changing economic and social conditions. But it's important to note that the people moving south today are often moving into very different circumstances than their grandparents left. They're moving to cities, not rural areas. They're professionals and retirees, not sharecroppers. Still, the symmetry is striking. A great movement north, then a movement back south. American history as a story of people in motion, always seeking better opportunities, always trying to find a place where they can thrive. But let's be honest, many of the problems the Great Migration exposed remain unresolved. Racial inequality in wealth, education, health, and justice persists. The neighborhoods where migrants settled are still, in many cases, segregated and under-resourced. The promise of the North, that migration would lead to equality, was only partially fulfilled. The civil rights movement, which gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, was partly a product of the Great Migration. The concentration of Black Americans in northern cities gave them political power. The contrast between southern and northern conditions made national action necessary. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., though from the South, built coalitions that included northern Black communities shaped by the migration. But even the victories of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, didn't completely eliminate the disparities created and reinforced during the migration era. Structural racism proved more resilient than laws alone could address. So the Great Migration's legacy is complex. It was an act of courage and self-determination by millions of people who refused to accept oppression. It transformed American society and culture in profound and lasting ways. But it also revealed the depths of American racism and the difficulty of achieving true equality. So let's bring this back to where we started. 6 million people. One of the largest internal migrations in human history. A movement that reshaped American cities, transformed American culture, and changed the course of American politics. And yet, how many people learn about this in school? How many Americans, when asked about major events in 20th century American history, would even mention the Great Migration? It's not taught with the same emphasis as World War I or World War II, even though it happened during both and was connected to both. It's not as famous as the Civil Rights Movement, even though it made that movement possible. Why? I think part of it is that the Great Migration doesn't fit neatly into the story America likes to tell about itself. It's not a story of American benevolence or heroism. It's a story of Americans fleeing American oppression. It's a story that exposes the lie of separate but equal and shows that racism wasn't just a Southern problem. It was a national problem that manifested differently in different regions, but was pervasive everywhere. But it's also a story of incredible human resilience. Think about what it took for a sharecropper in Mississippi to decide to pack up and leave for Chicago. Think about the courage, the hope, the determination. These weren't passive victims of history. These were people who took control of their own destinies, even when doing so was terrifying and risky. And think about what they built. They built communities. They built churches and businesses and cultural institutions. They raised children who became artists, activists, politicians, scholars, athletes. They created music and literature that defined American culture for the entire world. The Great Migration is a story about what happens when people refuse to accept the circumstances they're born into. It's about the human drive for dignity and opportunity. It's about how ordinary people making individual decisions can collectively change the course of history. If you're Black American with family that's been in this country for generations, there's a good chance your family story includes the Great Migration. Your grandparents or great-grandparents might have made that journey. The city you grew up in, the neighborhood you lived in, the church your family attended, all of that might trace back to decisions made by people who boarded trains heading north decades ago. If you're not Black, the Great Migration still shaped your life. The music you listen to, the sports you watch, the cities you know, the very rhythm and vocabulary of American culture, all of it was influenced by this movement. The political map of America, the issues we still grapple with around race and inequality, the urban landscape of American cities, all of it connects back to this history. History